Dear guests, all participants, welcome to the 8th presentation of ARWA's East Aegean and Anatolia section's year-long lecture series. This week, it's my pleasure to present Dr. Dries Daems of Middle East Technical University in Ankara, from my own department in settlement archaeology. After completing his BA and MA degrees at the University of Leuven, Dr. Daems completed his PhD at the same university in 2018. His doctoral research was focused on dynamics of social complexity and community formation in Southwest Anatolia from Iron Age to Hellenistic times, for which he received funding from Research Foundation Flanders. He is currently an assistant professor at the graduate program of settlement archaeology and digital archaeology at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And his main research interests include social complexity, urbanism, polis formation, agent-based modeling, pottery studies, and human environment interactions. And he pursues these interests specifically by investigating the Iron Age and Hellenistic Anatolia and the general Eastern Mediterranean. He works as a pottery specialist with the Sagalassos archaeological project in Turkey. He is also executive coordinator of the International Network for Agent-Based Modeling of Socio-Ecological Systems in Archaeology. We also know him by his recent book, Social Complexity and Complex Systems in Archaeology, recently published by Routledge. Today, Dries's lecture title is The Light and Shadow of Hellenism, the Hellenistic Period in Anatolia. Dries argues that the shadow of Hellenism has shaped our understanding of Hellenistic Anatolia, but there are a few rays of light to illuminate a potential way forward from this conundrum. Thus, he will actually deconstruct the narratives of Hellenization for the Anatolian scene, covering a wide range of topics, including social complexity trajectories from a complex systems perspective, urbanism, and the formation of urban hierarchies, as well as patterns of artisanal production and the spread of ideas in multi-scholar networks of trade, connectivity, and interaction. So welcome, Dries, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chidem, for a very nice and extensive introduction. And thank you very much to all of our participants and attendees today for my contribution to the ARWA lectures. I've been attending some of these lectures as they have been happening throughout the semester, and I've really learned a lot from periods that are not necessarily my main field or my main specialization. And I hope that today as well you will learn a few things about a period that is perhaps not your main specialization, that of the Hellenistic period. And when I was asked to give a talk about the Hellenistic period in Anatolia, I was thinking for some time as to how I would best frame this talk. Would I give a very extensive overview of what the Hellenistic period is all about and what we see, archaeologically speaking, on the level of urbanization, material culture, trade and exchange, social culture, etc., etc. But then I thought that is basically a course in and by itself, and I would not really do justice to such an overview within the limited time and space that is given to me here. So I was thinking to go back to actually one of the chapters in my PhD. As Chidem said, I finished my PhD in 2018, and I worked very extensively on how this idea of Hellenism, Hellenization, and Hellenistic culture has been framed in Anatolian studies, but also more broadly in Eastern Mediterranean as a light of civilization that is spread across this wide Eastern Mediterranean, Near Eastern time frame and space during the Hellenistic period. And that is something that I've tried to deconstruct a bit in that PhD research as well. So that deconstruction and how we can use that deconstruction to move forward and actually try and say or create a new narrative about urbanization and related topics in the Hellenistic period. From this new perspective, that's a bit the idea of the talk for today. And as with all talks, of course, I will start with a very brief historical setting and setting the stage for this beautiful period that is the Hellenistic time frame period is, of course, Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, starting in 334 BCE, with a series of major battles and clashes. Alexander the Great amasses this great empire ranging all the way from Macedon until the Indus Valley. Of course, the story is well known to all of you, so I don't have to go into too much detail there. But the Hellenistic period is interesting not because Alexander conquers this empire, it's because of what happens afterwards. It's basically already at the moment that Alexander dies, when his generals need to discuss the succession. There is in 323 BCE what's called the partition of Babylon, at least this is what it's called today, where the generals decide on the joint kingship between Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, and the unborn child of Alexander, Alexander IV, who are installed as joint kings with Perdiccas, one of his senior officers, as the regent. Now, in practice, what we see is that Alexander's generals started to manage part of that empire, first as satraps or governors, but gradually taking control for themselves of large chunks of that empire. Some of the most important ones are, for example, Antipater in what is Macedon and Greece, Antigonus in large parts of Anatolia, and Ptolemaeus, of course, in Egypt. And several of these generals in due time would start to eventually claim royal titles for themselves, thus effectively establishing a series of dynasties competing for control over what was once this huge empire. Now, if we zoom in a bit, throughout the Hellenistic period, we really see that Anatolia is one of the major battlegrounds between these generals, these kings vying for control over the empire. And especially two of the major players in that strife in Anatolia are the Seleucids, controlling most of the interior, and Ptolemies controlling several of the coastal areas. And it's this incessant competition between and warfare between these kingdoms that's going to be the major background for a lot of what I will be talking about today. Now, throughout the Hellenistic period, we see multiple changes happening. So from the early 3rd centuries onwards, a new player arises at the scene, the Attalids of Pergamon, who soon have to give way for what's called a Seleucid peak in the early 3rd century, early 2nd century BCE. Followed by the demise of the Seleucids following the Battle of Magnesia, the Peace of Apamea, which gives control over much areas of central Anatolia, or Western Anatolia, I should say, back to the Attalids. And this competition continues until at the end of the 2nd century, the Romans, who had well been involved in many of these conflicts, start to get a real foothold in Anatolia following the bequeathing of the Attalid kingdom by Attalus III to the Roman Senate. And basically from the 1st century onwards, we see the curtain call of this grand period with the coming of Rome, where increasingly these infighting parties have to succumb to the power of Rome, bringing an end to this period of constant competition and conflict between the Hellenistic kingdoms. And that is basically the backdrop of a lot of what will be happening today. Before I go into the detail of the Hellenistic period in Anatolia and what that means on the ground, I want to zoom out a bit and reflect just for a bit on what this idea of Hellenization actually means. So one of the perceived hallmarks of the Hellenistic period is the spread of Greek culture over many areas where it was until that time not present. So this was not necessarily a new phenomenon. The Greeks had been founding settlements across many areas of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, basically from the Iron Age onwards. Yet it has often been argued that the cultural impact of these settlements on their wider areas very much remained ephemeral. And it's only with the Hellenistic period that Hellenism, as this vector for socio-cultural change, is really considered to take off in earnest. Now, what does that concept of Hellenism actually mean? And that's a question we have to ask ourselves, especially for those areas outside of the Greek heartland, the Aegean, where this idea of a Greek culture first originated. But what about large tracts of Anatolia beyond the West Coast, let's say? Is it really effectively related to the appropriation of or the adoption of Greek cultural elements within these areas? If so, why would communities in Anatolia or other areas necessarily turn to that Greek culture as this hallmark that is to be emulated? And or was this merely a matter of preference and style? Were there deeper motives of social or political nature? Is it even logical to talk about in terms of the spread, dissemination, or adoption of Greek Hellenistic culture in the first place? And I specifically mention spread, dissemination, and adoption as three different nouns separately, because each of those supposes their own actors and own underlying drivers. It's the thing that I want to drive home here is that the idea of a paramount Greek model of community formation and material culture has been quite pervasive in a lot of scholarly work. And part of my argument here today is that these are at least partially born from somewhat problematic Eurocentric and Hellenocentric discourses that are present either implicitly or explicitly in a lot of academic work. And one of the solutions, the rays of light that I mentioned in the abstract, to move forward or to move beyond this conundrum, I have been looking for in what's called complex systems thinking, complexity theory, and I'll be talking about that in a bit. Before turning to that proposed solution, let's dissect this problem a bit further, starting very much with the roots of Hellenocentrism and Eurocentrism in what can be called a Greek form of ethnocentrism. So the idea that the Greeks themselves perceive themselves as superior to many other peoples. And we can turn to authors such as Herodotus, who mentions that there is this something as a common element that connects all of the Greeks, their common descent, their language, religion, a distinct way of life. And we can basically tie that to other authors then who take this a step further, such as Diogenes, who talks about or mentions or quotes, I should say, another source discussing a quote that's attributed either to Thales or Socrates. It's not clear which one, basically stating that he counts his blessing for one, being a human being and not an animal, two, being a man and not a woman, and three, being a Greek and not a barbarian. So this idea of the Greek people as above and beyond all of the others. And that can be very much tied into this idea, the concept of the Barbaros as a non-Greek, which initially was just a linguistic distinction as a Greek versus non-Greek speaker, that came to be associated with much more pejorative political and cultural prejudices, this idea of us versus them, very much within the context of an Athenian invention of the barbarian as the external other, of course, as part of the conflict with the Persian Empire, basically casting that which is considered not to be non-Greek as the antithesis to themselves, and themselves, the Athenians themselves, as the embodiment, the pinnacle of Greek culture. And this idea of the Greek as the representation, the manifestation of culture and civilization versus the other is something that very much lives on in much popular media today. Think of the very popular, famous movie 300, which came out some time ago, where this Eastern monolith is represented not only through a variety of Eastern soldiers forced to take the battlefield by the evil tyrant Xerxes, but also even containing literal monsters amongst their rank that are being pitted against the heroic Greeks. And this is very much an idea that that takes the other and really tries to even to a large extent demonize it in light of that Greek civilization. Now, this idea, this Greek ethnocentric idea, the idea of the Greeks being superior to many other peoples, is something that came to be appropriated in later times. So the Romans took this idea of Greece as the cradle of civilization. There's, of course, the famous quote of Horace in his epistles, who discusses how Rome, through the conquest of Greece, also brought civilization into its own ranks. A concept very much tied to that of the paideia, so building on an Athenian sense of superiority, a concept or a process that allowed non-Greeks to obtain a Greek identity through cultural learning, not only based on Greek language, but really an entire way of life. So going beyond a common descent, blood links, but really focusing on this aspect of culture as the main connecting mode of Hellenism, of Greek cultures, being perpetuated by the Romans, not only within their own society, but also through the adoption of a sense of ethnocentrism that identified them as the in-group versus those people, those what they then refer to as barbarians beyond the boundaries of the empire. And this idea of Hellenocentrism would be taken up in later times as well. So during the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries, there was this very strong agenda of casting Greece as the foundation for European civilization, as the place of origin for rationality, philosophy, and art. For example, Voltaire, in his Essai sur les Mœurs in 1756, proclaimed the arts, music, poetry, eloquence, history, and philosophy all had come from the Greeks and were descended towards European civilizations at that time. And that creation of a sense of European civilization during the Enlightenment, was very consciously and elaborately built on those classical foundations derived from ancient Greece and Rome. And like its classical precursors, it would also incorporate an explicitly ethnocentric view, casting the West versus the East, versus the Orient, a process exacerbated by the threat of the Turkish incursions in Europe, culminating in the Siege of Vienna in the middle of the 16th century, but really very explicitly casting European civilization as the basis, as founded on rationality and democracy, having to take a stand versus Eastern theocracy and tyranny was something that was very explicitly brought to the fore there, amongst others, in the writings of the German philosopher Hegel. Now, the thing that those Europeans did at that time, and what mainly distinguishes that Eurocentrism from any other form of ethnocentrism, is that it very consciously steps outside of time and space by positioning itself as the pinnacle of human development in morality, civilization, outside of any specific temporal and spatial context. So very strong normative conceptualizations of inferiority, casting every other culture, state, or whatever, as inferior to the superior modern West. And we see a very strong connection between Helleno and Eurocentrism, tied into this idea of social complexity that I also mentioned as something that I've worked very extensively on. The idea that we see teleological trajectories going from these modes of savagery, barbarism, up to civilization, in which there are very strong moral implications associated with of the conceptualization of success and failure. The idea that as societies progress towards civilization, they are successful in reaching the eventual goal of what humanity is supposed to be doing. And since the modern West is seen at the apex of that development, the modern West there at that time is considered to be the successful society, therefore also advocating or displaying the ultimate or the ultimate sense of morality and civilization as well. Now, what does that all mean for the study of the Hellenistic period, Hellenistic culture? It basically means that in a lot of studies, there is a very strong automatic assumption that Hellenistic culture is to be diffused. Because Hellenistic culture is, or Greek Hellenistic culture is considered to be at the foundations of that European civilization is placed at the very apex of humanity's trajectory through time. The widespread adoption of Greek as an official language, Greek-styled names, cultural practices, material culture, etc., is considered to be the result of local peoples to be inevitably drawn towards this superior Hellenistic culture. And that basically casts the idea, the process of Hellenization in a lot of different antagonistic terms. So on the one hand, openness, societies, culture that are open for this new influence will be able to incorporate those new ideas into their being, versus those that are isolated, are not successful in actually incorporating that, and will therefore be left behind on this ever increasing climb towards civilization. Terms of success and failure, civilization versus barbarism, but also complex societies versus simple societies, are all part of that framework. And in my work, I have basically turned to complex systems thinking to develop an alternative framework of interpretation for complexity in social systems, a framework that helps us to recast that complexity, not as a property of complex societies as such, but rather of human societies. The idea being that the fundamental unit of all human society is social interaction between people. Social interaction happening on a decentralized level, happening for whatever reason, within many different contexts, that through the inevitable combination of information exchange and interaction results in a emergent social organization. That emergent social organization which gives feedback to the interactions in and by themselves, thus shaping the way that these interactions take place, giving the foundations for the formation of societies, resulting in a two-way process of socialization, so generating rules of social behavior, where you have a bottom-up emergence of from social interactions and practices, creating this emergent multi-level social structure that then gives again feedback from these on an institutional level back to the interactions and the practices from between people, resulting in this two-way process of socialization. And a lot of these processes of Hellenization that I will be talking about, I will be discussing in a bit more detail later on what we mean with that, take place within this two-way process of socialization. The second aspect of this complexity approach is that I see social systems, societies, as consisting of flows of energy, resources, and information. And cities play a very important role in that, as they represent the physical manifestation of concentrations of energy and resources for a variety of reasons. So cities, one of their major characteristics is that they redirect flows from a wider area towards themselves to sustain urban functionalities in subsistence, fuel and heating needs, production, construction, etc., etc. Cities at the same time are also flows of information. So the idea that as you have more people gathering in a closer, denser context, you have more interaction going on, and this idea of cities as social reactors is built on that. Idea that as you increase your face-to-face interaction and your exchange of information, you will get increasing returns to scale in both social and economic cultural developments, resulting in again these feedback loops that make cities the vibrant context that they often are, not just today but also in the past. So that's a bit of the framework that I will be using in a very brief nutshell. So I had originally planned to do 3 separate case studies to discuss all this. In the end, it all ended up a bit more blended together. So I'll be talking about the origin of polis. I will be talking specifically, I will be zooming in mostly on the southwest of Anatolia, as this is what I have worked on the most, and I will very extensively discuss Sagalassos and Düzen as the main examples for my ideas, and I will of course incorporate lots of material culture into that discussion as well. So talking a bit first about the spread of the polis. The polis is very, as commonly translated as a city-state, is very typically considered to be an inherently Greek concept of urbanism. And that should already raise the question, right, if that is this typical Greek concept of urbanism, how applicable is that for any region outside of the Greek or the Aegean heartland, let's say, for example, Anatolia? A good starting point for what we mean with the polis is always to go back to the massive Copenhagen polis project that embarked to compile a survey, an inventory of polis communities. Who identified basically up to 1,500 polis in archaic and classical times all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And looking at all of the historical textual sources for the polis, they basically identified 4 main categories for which the term was used in those time periods, at least. So first, a stronghold, a physical stronghold or hilltop settlement. Again, a physical nucleated settlement, the idea of a combination of town and hinterland, and fourthly, a political community. So we have 2 main usages of the term, basically. On the one hand, a physical settlement, on the other hand, a political community that is embodied within that settlement. Basically, this is the main range of attestations of the polis in those sources. Of course, that doesn't mean that gives us necessarily a comprehensive overview of what, or an encompassing overview, I should say, of how many and which polis there were in the past. So basically, the project identified 3 categories of polis. Those is explicitly denoted as polis in the ancient sources, but also those subsumed under the heading of polis by ancient authors alongside a number of other communities, so not identified specifically explicitly themselves as a polis community. And third, those settlements not explicitly mentioned as a polis, but known for 1 or more activities or traits characteristically associated with the Greek polis. So what were those traits? Those traits were compiled based on those textual sources, giving you a very extensive list. Of course, I'm not going to go into the detail of each of those traits individually, but if we look at a bit more detail at the major groups of traits, we see 2 main categories, basically. In yellow, those that can be perhaps considered more specifically Greek traits, whereas in blue, those are rather more generic traits that are not necessarily relevant only for a Greek context and not necessarily only relevant for identifying a Greek polis as such. Moreover, the Copenhagen Polis project, or Copenhagen Polis Center, I should say, developed what they call a polythetic approach, meaning that not a single combination of traits can be used to identify a polis. However, that creates a bit of a tension between the generic nature of these individual traits and the overall aim of identifying specifically Greek polis. Now, of course, the center was aware of this tension, and what they did was also consider to what extent the polis can be considered an explicitly Greek phenomenon, and to what extent it is part of a broader phenomenon, the idea of not just the Greek city-state as a unique phenomenon in by itself, but actually as an attestation, instantiation of a wider category of city-state cultures. And they identified a wide range of those cultures across time and space, of which some of or most of those have been mapped here. But basically, it means that if the identification, it basically means that we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a polis if we can't identify it from specific sets of traits, or at least we cannot distinguish it necessarily very strongly from this wider category of city-state cultures, then definition of a polis becomes a bit tricky. And I like to refer to a definition by Clifford Ando, which is a very generic definition, who states that the polis is a combination of population, sets of institutions, centered on an agglomerated settlement that asserts dominance over a wider populational landscape. And that means basically that if the identification of a polis is not possible through a specific trait per se, it can only be possible through the context of these features. So what it means to be a polis needs to be derived from the context in which it was originally developed, that of the Greek heartland in the Aegean. Now, if we briefly look at the Aegean, I have here some data from the Copenhagen Polis project that basically takes, again, this very generic definition of the polis as a small nucleated urban and political center with an associated hinterland. But something that seems to be very typical is that it is indeed a entity, a polity of a small size, a small scale. As you see in the table here, only 6% of all attested polis have an associated territory of more than 500 square kilometers, which in many contexts is not that much. So that at least seems to be a quite significant factor there. And it's this idea of rather restricted territorial expansion that is also going to be part of some of a very generic model that I will talk about in a minute, that outlines how the polis came to be. So for the origin of polis, I turn to this generalized model of polis formation, one that is developed initially for Boeotia by John Bindliff. That's based on more generic cross-cultural attractor states and selection pressures for social organization, using also fission-fusion dynamics. And some of those selection pressures are, for example, cognitive limits to information processing, desire for intra-group endogamy, and a threshold on walking distance limits and catchment areas. So in this model from Bindliff, we see a very general process of population increase happening from the early Iron Age onwards, but under a system state of very strong selection pressures for small and nucleated settlements, defined by a territory of up to half an hour walking distance from the center to the outer border. As these centers are also, or as the selection pressures are also very strongly focused on maintaining small community sizes, we see gradually, rather than settlements growing larger in size, we see new communities popping up, resulting in a graduate landscape infilling, which eventually turned into the basic settlement distribution that gave rise to the polis system in classical times. Now, how does that come to be? The most important internal social dynamic that defined community sizes within these communities were selection pressures influencing fission-fusion dynamics. So cognitive limits to information processing, which imposed limitations to social group sizes, keeping most of these communities in a basin of attraction focused on small nucleated settlements. Some groups at some point then developed an additional mechanism or additional mechanisms of social organization, both on a hierarchical or heterarchical level, both are possible, which allowed, or which could allow the potential for group sizes to increase, therefore also allowing potential for social complexity to increase as well. As population size grows, so do social groups, the composition of social groups, roles and social roles and structures, organizations in a denser environment, allowing more interactions and connections to take place. This idea again of the urban community as a social reactor fueling socioeconomical development is something that we see taking place, especially once this full landscape here has been gradually filled up by these small nucleated communities. And there is no more space for additional fission dynamics to happen. At that point, we see certain, what Bindliff calls proto-polis, absorbing other communities or taking over other communities, therefore enlarging their thus enlarging their population sizes, increasing their territorial sizes, requiring more forms of extensive social organization and institutions to also manage these larger territories, resulting in the emergence of a socio-political and economic elite, who also started with new forms of material culture, monumental architecture. In short, the process of polis formation as we see it very extensively in the literature, as we see it in the archaeological record, is what starts at this point. Now, the reason why some of these communities initiated processes of polis formation and others did not is not easy to answer. Some might have been slightly bigger than others. For example, for Thebes, this is likely to have been the case. Some may have had some locational advantages. Some may have had just a more skillful leader to guide them through this process. It's important to note, however, that from a complex systems perspective, the reason or the question why something happens is not always a useful question to begin with. Given that we have to be aware of the high degree of contingency that is taking place in these historical system trajectories. And I'll be returning back to that question of why in the end as well. But let me first turn back to the polis in Anatolia. We have to be aware that the inventory that I've been talking about is mainly concerned with archaic and classical period polis. So what about Hellenistic period and what about Anatolia? There's a quote from Stephen Mitchell who says that there were no polis in the interior of Asia Minor before the end of the 4th century. Now, that obviously implies that they were there afterwards. So what is happening in our Hellenistic period? One of the main or most visible developments during the Hellenistic period is a wave of urbanization that takes place in inland Anatolia during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Of course, when talking about this wave of urbanization and the origin of polis in Anatolia, at this point we cannot ignore the role of these Hellenistic kings. So as you see on the map on the left, these are all city foundations by the various dynasties, Hellenistic kingdoms, driving or stimulating urban formation in many parts of the interior. And part of the explanation for that, I think, can be found in this widespread competition, conflict, and interaction between the various kingdoms, which can be considered a very important driver of change. Of course, means that we have so many different actors at play here. We have the monarchs themselves, the royal administrations, but also local civic governments and citizens that are all trying to make sense of this widely unstable and dangerous political space. And we have to be very much aware that the Hellenistic kingdoms were at the core networks of very personal relationships. So representing a very highly dynamic nature of power relationships that are difficult to capture through traditional means, maps, but also through archaeological data. However, one example that I would just like to briefly show you of this kind of community connectivity in the epigraphic record is through the institution of Proxenia, so a way for polis to formally engage in relationships with external benefactors, very often citizens of another community, which is a institution that goes back to the 6th century, but is very much a Hellenistic phenomenon. This is where these Proxenia relationships, connections are at its most dense, at its most extensive, where it's at its peak in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, followed by a very stark decline of Proxenia agreements in the 1st century BCE. And again, I will argue that this is very strongly related to the dynamic competition between these Hellenistic kings, and as well as the interactions between cities and kings or amongst cities themselves, as part of trying to navigate these unstable political times that we see throughout many years of the Hellenistic period. I'm not going to talk about Lycia in too much detail because I want to start moving towards Sagalassos for the second part of the talk. But basically I want to point towards, again, this distinction between the coastal and the interior areas of Lycia. So more sites being present on the coastal areas, more polis communities being present on the coastal areas versus the interior is something that we very strongly see there. Some general trends are that the existent urbanization in the coastal areas of Lycia go back all the way to the 8th century BCE to sites such as Afshar Tepesi, Xanthos, Limira, Telmessos, the so-called Herrensitzen of these local principalities, followed by a new wave of urban development in the 5th century, but all part not necessarily of any Hellenization or influence of Greek culture, or the adoption of Greek cultural elements, but very much part of a local, what was also identified by Hansen as a Lycian city-state culture. So very much based on local cultural elements such as monumental grave architecture, shared coinage standards, and also the Lycian language, of course, best known from the trilingual Lithuanian stele. So this idea of this endogenous local culture, which at that point has not necessarily a strong Greek component to it. Now, from the 4th and 3rd centuries BC onwards, many scholars, researchers working on Lycia are going to recast the continuation of these processes within the framework of polis formation. So, for example, the urban emergence of Kianaei, growing in importance in the 4th century, is by Frank Kolb stated or interpreted as a indication of a process of polis formation. So the development of this political urban center, monumental buildings, cults that are being attested, coinage, Greek language that's being used, etc., etc. Xanthos has been even uses the term polis specifically in some of its inscriptions. So there's definitely something going on, but I would again stress that this not necessarily imply a Greek cultural identity. So the usage of Greek on official media, coins, inscriptions, decrees should be seen as much more part of a language of central participating in the language of central administration and power from the end of the 4th century BC onwards. So the idea that Greek is the language of power in the Hellenistic dynasties is the most important factor to explain this development, and should also be noted that the Lycian language remains in use for quite some time throughout the Hellenistic period as well. And so to refer back to this tension fields between Greek city-states or Greek cultural elements, very specifically, versus more generic city-state culture, I think we see a more generic set of processes happening within a very specific socio-cultural context, where Greek cultural elements had some role, but by no means were necessarily predominant in and by themselves, and definitely not necessarily desirable just for the sake of cultural superiority. And that's, I think, the main point to take with this. Moving onwards to Pisidia, in Pisidia we have a very strong tradition of fortified hilltop settlements from the early Iron Age onwards, and it's only again from the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC onwards that we see a stronger second wave of urbanization happening. Now, some indications are present for the emergence of political communities already in the 3rd century BCE. So civic coinage attested at sites such as Etena and Kremna, a honorific inscription dated to the early 3rd century BC at Termessos. But this is not followed by a very extensive signal in the archaeological record showing any kind of urban developments associated with that. Now, this might be a temporal, or might be the result of some tension in the resolution of our archaeological sources versus written sources. It might be a delay of what we could call the crystallization of a new way of political structures and classes that is not yet captured in the archaeological records at the beginning of the 3rd century BCE. It's difficult to say at this point. One element of urbanism that we can point towards is the attestation of several Seleucid colonies in the second part of the 3rd century BC, such as Laodicea, Apamea, Apollonia, Antiochia, and Seleucia, all controlling very strategic locations as part of wider road and trade networks. So that's basically the situation in Pisidia in a nutshell. Let me zoom in a bit and talk about my work at Sagalassos. And for also a large part of my PhD, I worked on the early phases of two settlements, Düzen, which you can see here on the plateau, and Sagalassos, which you can see here, in the late Achaemenid and Hellenistic times. Most of our evidence from these two periods comes from Düzen, where we have a combination of archaeological excavations, surveys, and geophysical research, showing us a very good image of the layout of the settlement, also how buildings and structures were constructed. And as you can see in this cartoon impression, basically what we have here is a fairly sizable village community, so where vernacular architecture was predominant, where there are not very strong indications for social stratification or inequality as far as we can see, and where also the artisanal production seems to be much geared towards a locally oriented productive landscape. So the idea that people were going to look for raw materials at the most convenient locations close to the site rather than targeting quality sources for production. We see a limited production infrastructure with just one or two kilns that probably serve the entire community. The functional assemblage of specifically pottery production, which I focused on, was fairly limited with not much variety in shapes. There was limited import. Also, the material from the site itself did not find a very extensive distribution. In total, or in some, we're talking about subsistence production aimed to serve the local community. Now, when we compare Düzen and Sagalassos at this point, we see that we know both communities originated in the late 5th century BC. This is when we find the first material culture in sufficiently extensive amounts to talk about the presence of a local community, which at this point is the first communities that emerge in this part of the landscape in the Alasun Valley. So possibly suggesting a tangent of this process of landscape filling, so new areas being unlocked for the habitation of human communities, which until that point had not been used before. At this point, we're talking about what, from the framework of John Bindliff, can be considered corporate communities, so displaying signs of town life, social political organization, but not yet any form of urban transformation, and very much centered on a core area of a 2 to 3 kilometer radius. And from the late Achaemenid period on until the 2nd century BCE, this is basically the situation that continued. In the 2nd century, however, we see first divergent development. Sagalassos transforms into an urban center, and at the same time, Düzen is abandoned. Now, this interesting dynamic between Sagalassos and Düzen, and related to that, the sustainability of that local landscape during the urban transformation of Sagalassos in the Hellenistic period. I have, from my PhD research, casted within this broader context of polis formation. So the idea that we have new forms of material culture, monumental architecture, the first attestation of formal laws and governmental institutions, the integration of the site within broader networks of economic exchange and trade, the formation of a broader, more extended territory that allowed for a broader base for the exploitation of energy and resources, are all aspects of that broader process of polis formation. I'm going to now skip a few slides because they are just going to give a bit more information on what I said already. And then I would like to pause again here and basically consider for a moment, okay, we see a lot of stuff happening. Now, what can be considered the drivers of this urbanism and sociocultural change, and why do we see it happening at Sagalassos and not at Düzen? It's not a question that I raised for the first time. It was raised for the first time by the excavators of the site, Hannelore van Averbeek and Kim Vinke, who thought they found part, or who sought part of that solution in the antithesis of, on the one hand, a progressive and open Sagalassos open to obtain a Hellenistic, Hellenized culture and everything that is associated with that, versus a Düzen, which they describe literally as being more isolated and old-fashioned. So this idea of Hellenization versus Düzen as the avatar of indigenous Pisidian culture, as it were. And they even describe that the evidence at Sagalassos shows that even that other authors who thought that the Pisidians were rather primitive, particularly warlike and unruly people, now have to adjust their views because recent studies can question this perception by documenting the high degree of Hellenization in Pisidian cities. So literally juxtaposing or really casting the idea of civilization within the Pisidian context as the onset of Hellenization. So Hellenization as a direct equation with civilization is something that is very explicitly brought to the fore as the explanatory framework for the idea or the observation that we have on the one hand, Sagalassos transforming into an urban center, Düzen being abandoned. I think from what I've been talking about so far, I hope to have made clear that this is not an explanatory framework that I particularly agree with. So two more potential processes have been proposed. So on one hand, that the urban transformation of Sagalassos basically caused subsistence problems due to the limits in the catchment area. So insofar that our two communities, small to moderate village communities, were not going to be extensively needing more energy and resources associated with this with such an urban transformation, all went fine. As soon as Sagalassos started to transform and started to require more energy and resources from a broader area, perhaps the local catchment area was overburdened and could not sustain such a development related to increasing population sizes, related to the needs for increased resource exploitation. That's one. The second, which I will already say is the one that I will be putting forward here, is that we have here a manifestation of how different incentives and selection pressures developed within a changing Hellenistic world, and how local communities could act upon those incentives and selection pressures in an attempt to try and navigate the broader social, political, economic framework of the time. And it will cast this idea in the perspective of multi-scalar networks between cities, between kings on different levels. Before going there, however, we wanted to check to what extent the idea of subsistence needs and subsistence limitations could have been perhaps an explanatory factor in and by itself. And for that, we developed an agent-based model of resource exploitation and subsistence strategies, focusing on our study area in the vicinity of Sagalassos, going from the Iron Age until the Hellenistic times. So trying to really frame this development within its prior periods, and basically allowing us to explore the bottom-up decision-making on the level of households for the exploitation of three main resources: foodstuffs, clay, and wood. That's a more simplified version of just the wider variety of resources that a community might need. Implement that in a realistic GIS environment, and then run to see what the implications for our resource exploitation are on the level of the community. The details of the graphs here don't particularly matter. We have here the stocks of our three resources for a scenario of high demand. So a scenario in which there is high pressure on the landscape, trying to figure out what communities were sustainable and what not. The main thing to take away here is that, generally speaking, in most scenarios, Düzen actually outperforms Sagalassos. And that's interesting. If we also look at the simulation of the catchment area of those two communities, we see that on average, Düzen has smaller or more limited walking times needed to reach agricultural plots. So the people of Sagalassos needed to walk further to get suitable agricultural plots. Sagalassos required a larger, on the whole, a larger catchment area than Düzen. So that's interesting. Because it looks like from a geographic perspective that Düzen has been dealt better cards for survival. Yet that's not necessarily what we see in the archaeological record. As I said, Düzen at some point is abandoned. Sagalassos transforms into an urban center of some local and regional importance. So if we look at the catchment area as it is, we see that basically, okay, our two communities are located very closely together. It's 1.8 kilometers as the crow flies, and Basically, if you would take an area starting from Sagalassos of 3 hours walk, then Düzentepe is well within that catchment area. It's interesting that from the very beginning of the late Achaemenid period, the pottery material of Sagalassos, here in blue, is dominant across the entire central Ağlasun Valley. Düzentepe, here in red, only has a few attestations of pottery, mostly linked to a passageway which we found going towards the site here. Meaning that Sagalassos has a much more extensive and easier access to most of the valley, whereas Düzentepe is much more confined to the plateau in which it was situated. So different geographical circumstances. Part of the idea, or part of the suggestion that that I'm making for this divergent development is that as long as our two settlements remained in our attractor state of small nucleated village communities, the difference of that geographic or the geographic difference didn't necessarily matter too much. But as soon as our incentives changed, then we have our standard economic adage: location, location, location. Location is super important. Why? What could have changed, or what could have caused these incentives and selection pressures to change? The suggestion again is that we are dealing with this competition between and the interaction between the various Hellenistic kingdoms. And we know from many sources that specifically the Seleucids were very active in trying to promote local communities to stimulate local communities to develop in forms of market formation and socio-political and economic structures as part of a wider policy of economic monetization. So the idea that is derived from the model of Apergis is that the Seleucid royal economy was based on the need for silver to maintain their army, and thus stimulating the formation of markets and the emergence of urban centers throughout many of their areas, so that taxes could be paid in silver rather than in kind. We know that for many areas, they stimulated processes of synoikismos to enlarge the economic base for our local communities. And it's possible that we see, and this in Sagalassos and Düzentepe as well, maybe the abandonment of Düzentepe can be the manifestation of such a synoikismos event in our area. It's difficult to prove conclusively, but it's an argument that me and my colleague Peter Talun have made in a recent paper that appeared in Basel earlier this year. But basically, the idea that new incentives, new policies are being expressed by these Hellenistic kingdoms, to which different responses are possible. Local communities can choose to engage with these incentives or not. And part of this divergent development, I think, can be found in how different communities engage with these kind of incentives. If we want to answer the question of why certain communities originated and development, I think this idea or this perspective of multiple selection pressures is important. Initial conditions is also important. As I said, one of the initial conditions that we know of is geographic differences. That's one of the easiest to attest, of course. We always have to be aware of the risks of geographical determinism, over representing geographical factors in the potential explanatory causal factors. There is, of course, Apache data for the social life, so that's something that's very difficult to ascertain. But again, we have to be aware that the reasons for a divergent development between Sagalassos and Düzentepe may also be very much part of this contingency of history. And maybe there is not, or very likely, there is not a single causal factor that will have that can explain this divergent development, but rather a complex interaction between multiple causal processes in which at some point Sagalassos engaged with a changing set of incentives related to wider economic and political policies, whereas for some reason Düzentepe chose not to do that. And so as a conclusion for this talk, as well as a way forward, I would like to advocate for approaching the Hellenistic period from what you could call the perspective of networks. And of course, using Sagalassos and Düzen a bit as a pax pro toto for the wider development of urbanism in Hellenistic Anatolia. First of all, stating that a model of Greek cultural change and influence is not sufficient explanatory model of change for what we see in the Hellenistic period in Anatolia. Sagalassos did not develop into an urban center because it adopted Greek identities, because it was open and progressive and successful in embracing the wider Hellenistic culture as such. But rather, I think we should recast Hellenistic urbanism as the result of all of these multi-level interactions between communities and polities. So networks on multiple levels within the community, across different communities within a regional or interregional context, and in an interregional context as part of this this interaction space between cities and kings. It also helps to recast our cities as urban attractor poles. So cities as hubs of energy, resources, and information, as being influenced by both first and second order attractors. So first orders being locational factors, soil quality, water, resource availability, topography, etc. But also second order attractors, the structural integration of such communities within wider networks. The idea again of networks, also generating feedback loops, regardless of our catalyst. Again, the driver and the question of why is very difficult to answer. But the idea that once such a process is set in motion, feedback loops can arise that drive the system towards a wholly new and unexpected system state. And I think, in my opinion at least, such a framework at least allows us to understand how certain historical processes unfolded, and it lets us contextualize these without the need for reverting back to any unidirectional or overly simplified explanatory models of change that are so often still suffering from these evolutionary trajectories, even if it's in a very implicit way. So I think that this approach offers us a lot more ways forward, and I really do hope that others feel inspired to explore these approaches themselves, and that we can start building this framework also within the context of Hellenistic Anatolia, but Hellenistic period, classical archaeology, Mediterranean archaeology, etc. As one of those additional tools in the toolbox for the archaeologist. With that, I think I have exhausted the entire hour that was given to me, so I will just say thank you, and all questions are very welcome.